Okay, everybody, welcome to this week's edition of Build with Ascend, the place where we come and talk about how you build data pipelines. My name is Paul Lacey. I'm the head of product marketing here at Ascend, and I'm joined by my colleague, John Saltzman, who is a product engineer here at Ascend. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how you build data shares with Ascend. So how can you share data in a variety of different ways on Ascend? For those of you that aren't familiar, Ascend is the data pipeline automation platform that helps you build and automate your data pipelines and helps you run intelligent data pipelines in a variety of different scenarios. We're so happy you could join us here today. We're going to be a couple of housekeeping items. We're recording the session today, so there's no need to take frantic notes. You can kind of sit back and relax and shoot us your questions. And that's the other thing is we leave lots of time open for questions at the end of these things because we really want to spend some time with you all and kind of have an interaction. And that's the benefit of joining these things live as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to John and fade into the background.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to see everybody again. So we're continuing actually building on the session that we did last week where we talked about data planes. Here we're actually talking about a feature that's currently in private preview called data shares. So if you participated in our event last week, you'll remember this slide where we talked about the different planes that make up the different layers of the Ascend architecture, including the layers that are part of the Ascend product, the data plane layer with their associated data clouds, Snowflake, BigQuery, Databricks, and then the public cloud layer, basically where the cloud infrastructure runs, which pretty much everything runs on cloud infrastructure these days. So we'll be building on top of this today, but we'll stay focused mostly around kind of with the data plane, a little bit about the build plane as well, and kind of the control plane for how data shares interact with those different layers of the architecture. And also building on last week's session, we kind of left off with this interesting picture and said, seems to be a pattern emerging here. We've got these different data planes and they're organized in a grid. And what is it that I'm actually seeing here? And if you're familiar with sort of current events in the data industry, you'll know that there's this concept of basically like within organizations having different data systems and different data teams and connecting everything to everything. And this concept is often referred to as a concept of a data mesh. So these pictures below, does this look like a mesh to you? Keep an eye on the one in the center here, where every point is connected to every other point, because you'll continue to see it a whole bunch throughout this presentation. And you'll see how data shares are one of the key mechanisms and key enablers that enables this kind of sharing between data planes. First, it's helpful to go and look at the bigger picture of data services and data planes just to relate them together, so we'll understand the context of how data shares fit into this. So on the bottom, we have the cloud plane, the light blue. We have the data planes that, generally speaking, live on top of cloud infrastructure. Then on top of that, we put Ascend, which has multiple layers, but we kind of simplify it down to what users will see when they actually are building every day in the platform, which are data services, data flows, which are the little tiny sequence of boxes. Those are basically data flows. These are basically what make up your overall data pipelines in your organization. And the relationship between these two things is that, generally speaking, one data service will run on a single data plane. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have more than one data service running on the same data plane. You can. But for this example, for this demo, we're just keeping it simple. One data service maps to one data plane. We have one of each different flavor, basically, in here for the demo. These different layers, if you're familiar with data mesh architecture, like the bottom of the picture that for data mesh usually involves the infrastructure. The top usually involves kind of the domains, the context, the pipelines, and the interconnections between those things. And here yet, we don't actually see those interconnections. But let's see how data shares actually help enable those interconnections. So again, we start with our data plane layer. And on top of that, we have our Ascend layer. And now you see a new primitive declarative component called a data share. So this is a component that you'll see in the UI. A previous version of it that was less featureful was the data feed functionality, if you're familiar with Ascend. This is like data feeds times 1,000, basically. So data shares are basically the mechanism that enables, there's that shape, the cross connection of data services, which could be running across different data planes. Again, here we have one of each. So data shares are one of those key enabling things that enables that connectivity. And part of the sharing functionality, we have our Ascend verbs, right? Ingest, transform, share. These are different Ascend verbs for things. And this falls under our sharing verb. So you can share and subscribe to data products that you create in Ascend across data planes, and data shares make this easy. That's the whole point of the demo today. The demo today, we're going to use a hypothetical scenario to keep it simple, because you can go crazy with domain-driven design and bounded contexts and what is a domain and all these other things. We just keep it simple. We'll just treat it like we have 4 separate domains. Each one is its own data service. And these data services are customers, inventory, visitors, and orders. There are different teams looking after each of these functional areas. So maybe we have an inventory and logistics team looking after one part, or fulfillment team. Maybe we have an order management team looking after another area. We have our maybe website traffic team, our web team that's looking after our visitors traffic to our maybe our e-commerce site or our website or something like that. And we have our maybe our customer service or maybe our customer relationship management team that looks after our customers, that are all working together and wanting to basically interconnect their different data pipelines, their data flows in Ascend. And they're making two kinds of data products. This comes straight from standard data mesh architecture. There are operational data products. These are more like your transactional raw data that you're willing to share between your different, domains and your different bounded contexts. And then there's the analytical data products. If you notice, the colors are a little different here. Just this, what the colors represent of green, red, purple, that's basically a read connector, a transform, and a data share. You also have the purple, red, purple, and that's kind of like I'm reading a data share, transforming it, and producing another thing that I'm sharing out to the organization as an analytical data product. So these different teams have all built their pipelines. Some of them are sharing analytical data products between each other. And this is what we're going to actually go see in the actual demo today. So without further ado, let's jump straight into demo time. So first we'll jump into, this is an Ascend Cloud cell. So this is running on cloud without Ascend.io. This is the Ascend Cloud environment. And you can see at the top level, I have those data services, just like we saw in the picture: customers, inventory, orders, and visitors. So now if you can sort of imagine, maybe each one of these areas is looked after by a particular team. Maybe my customer service or my account management team's looking after my customer data. And maybe for my operational customer data, in this particular case, we have it in BigQuery. No particular reason why, just to be able to show off different data planes. But we have some raw customer data. We have a BigQuery SQL transform where we're just basically normalizing some names. These are all fake names, by the way, for that matter, although they look real. This is all fake data. And we're creating like a concatenated full name, basically, with it, which is uppercase, to normalize it. And then this nice core data set of kind of customer data, we're basically going out and sharing that out as a core data set. So this would be like a core operational data set. Very easy to do that. I really just went in and I said, create a new data share, gave it a name. You can choose when you create a data share what permissions those data shares have. So you can basically share that data product with all data services in this environment, or you can also limit it to specific ones. In this case, customers are pretty core one. There's nothing that we have in here that's too sensitive. So we're going to share that across our entire organization and publish this. So that's basically the operational data product that's being shared by this customer's domain. We'll give this a second to refresh. Oh, looks like my internet connection might have dropped for a second here. You guys still there? Oh, okay. I think my internet just dropped for a second. Okay. So here we see basically those high-level data services again. And we see another one here, which is called customer analytics. So this is for the analytical data product that the team builds, this customer service management hypothetical team. And they're using data from other domains to build that. So in this case, let's say that what they wanted to do is they have some dashboard or report where you can see all your customers, and maybe you want to see, how many web traffic visits for each individual customer, just some high-level metric. How much time have they spent on our site, and how many visits have they had historically over their lifetime, something like that. So I've already got that data. My domain team for the web traffic visitors domain has already gone and created that raw visits data. And you can basically see that they've got that raw data, and they've already went so far as to create an aggregate customer visits. And what is an aggregate customer visits? Well, it's basically just data that's aggregated up by customer ID, and it's total lifetime visits, time spent, and the number of days since the first visit. So they had some raw data that was in a data lake, they aggregated it up, and then they published it as a data product. So as that customer team, I have a business requirement. I need to power a dashboard, a report, some kind of logic in my application that uses the data that I have, which is my core customer data here, and that aggregate customer visits data. So how did I get that in here? Well, here I said connect to a data share. And this is basically our data share catalog. This is showing you data products shared from across the environment. And you can see in here, there was that visitors data service and that aggregate customer visits data share, which has the data that I want to be able to use as this customer service team to produce that analytical product. So I take these two data sets, which are basically related to each other based on the customer ID. I literally just write a nice little SQL query joining those two things together on the customer ID, which is basically the same level of atomicity or granularity of the data on both sides. And I produce another data product. So this is an analytical data product now. This is giving me the combination of the two things. It's giving me my customer information at a high level, along with the total visits that they had over their lifetime, how much time they spent there, how many days since their first visit, and so forth. And because the customer team's like, hey, I made a really cool analytical data product, they once again wanted to share it as a data product out into the mesh. So they published it as a data share, which makes it available to all the other domain teams as well. So that's the customer service team and their kind of operational data and their analytical data. We kind of mentioned the inventory team. At the moment, they've just got a very simple pipeline. They're pulling some inventory orders that they, for whatever reason, it's stored in a lake. It's in Google Cloud Storage. They have a little query that says, hey, people always want to know, like, what's the latest inventory? What do we have on hand and so forth. So they just have a little aggregate query that says, just go grab what the current inventory is as of right now, basically, and get that information out there. And then they publish that current inventory information out again with a data share. Very simple, similar concept, create a data share, who has access to it. If I look at this, I can see here, again, all data services have access to it. And that's really the inventory domain and what they've done. They basically made this aggregate data available. So I can see that there's a subscriber to this particular data set, and it's over in another data service, the order management one. This is where my order management team, my order domain is basically operating. If I click on this, it takes me straight over to that other data flow that's subscribing to it. Now, if I didn't have permissions to do that, it wouldn't have let me go in there. But I have permissions to see this data flow, so I can just jump directly into it. Just to show you where we just jumped into, so you're clear, here we have the orders data service for the order management domain. And the order team has their kind of raw transactional data, their core order data. They do a little bit of enrichments on that order. I think they just calculate an extended cost per order or something like that, quantity times price. And then they publish that out to the organization as kind of the core order data set. But where we jumped into from the other data service and the other data flow was in the order analytics. And here again, we see another kind of data sharing and data mesh effect. Here we are taking current inventory data from the inventory management team. How did I get that? I went to connect to data share, current inventory, and basically just created that data share here. If we open that data share up and we actually look at it, now this is an interesting one. So if we kind of look at this for a second, we can see that here we're actually in a Snowflake data plane. If I go back to my kind of earlier picture, the order team's in Snowflake, and they're trying to do something where they're trying to combine current inventory information, which inventory information is in Databricks. So they're going across different data planes here. And when they create this data share to pull the inventory data in, you'll see that there's this setting here and it says materialize on and you can't change it. When you go across different data planes, Ascend makes a copy of that data from the source system into the destination automatically for you and keeps that copy up to date if you choose continuous subscription model, where it's basically always updating when the upstream changes. We'll show you in a minute another feature called scheduled data shares, where you control how frequently that refresh occurs. In this environment, we don't have it turned on, so I can't demo that particular one, but I'll show that to you in a second. Anyway, we subscribe from the Databricks tables into Snowflake, and the data is now copied and ingested into Snowflake. So when I'm doing these queries, it's all happening within the Snowflake data plane on a copy of data that's been brought over and is being managed for me. And then I also imported something that the order management team already had in Snowflake. So basically it was already here. I'm using a data feed that I created as part of that order management team. And in this one, you can see that the materialize setting is turned off. In this case, no data is copied. The data is in both copies of the data are essentially in the same data plane. There's actually only one copy of the data for this particular data share. And since it's the same data plane, I don't need to materialize a copy of it. It's already there. I just need to reference it. So this one is a non-materialized data share. So you'll see materialized data shares and non-materialized data shares. And depending on the context of how you create it, you can choose whether you want it to be materialized or not. So it's a choice. It's something you have control over. In this case, so I'm basically referencing something that already exists, and I'm importing some data from another data plane from over in Databricks. And then I'm doing a calculation, figure out on a running total basis how much inventory is remaining based on the consumption from orders. This is a little bit made up scenario, but you kind of get the idea. We're burning down our inventory basically over our orders. So we have this nice inventory remaining, and hey, this is another analytical data product that somebody might want to use, right? So similarly, again, we went in here, created a data share, and we decided who has access to that data share. In here, we actually chose to only make that data available to the inventory data service and the data service I'm already in, which is orders. And the reason for that is maybe the inventory levels is a little bit sensitive, and maybe how much inventory remaining isn't important to everyone in the organization, or maybe it's a little bit like not everybody needs to see that information. So we just limit it to those domains, to limit it to those bounded contexts where it makes sense for them to see this analytical data product. And they're basically publishing this analytical data product out of the order analytics, basically the order analytics data flow in the order management, if you will, data service. So that was a whole bunch of stuff. And you can easily see that, like, once you start building a data mesh, it actually mirrors what exactly happens in organizations when you start sharing data across different contexts. Now, before you get like overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, all these connections, all these other things. This is what people naturally do in organizations. What we're giving you is a tool to govern this. Data shares gives you controls over that, as long as you do it within the Ascend platform. And it lets you have a streamlined interface for sharing and creating these data products. This will happen no matter what tool you use, that people will have different perspectives and different needs within their different organizational units. So it's not something to be afraid of. It's something to have visibility around. It's something to be able to govern and to see through that catalog. And it's something to, what generally tends to happen is the best data products, the ones that are the most accurate, that are the vetted ones, that are the supported ones, generally those tend to evolve and survive, whereas the lesser supported ones generally tend to phase out. There's a natural process for data products and how you share data in organizations that kind of happens just by itself. But it's good to have governance around it for sure. And that's a key part of data mesh. So then the last thing that I was going to show in here was, let's say we were this web traffic team. And we too have some additional questions and things that we want to answer that we could construct from these different data products that have been made available. So we have our kind of core operational data, but here what we're going to do is we're going to connect to some other data shares. And basically we want to look at the kind of aggregate visits that we have, which we created. So we can go ahead and connect directly to that. So as you can see, when I go here to connect to a data share, this is one of the ones that my team, the visitor management team, let's say, creates. I can click subscribe. I can choose whether this should be materialized or not. Since it's the same data plane, I don't have to materialize it, so I'm not going to. And the other thing that I want to be able to do here is I want to be able to take these aggregate visits, but I also want to be able to see for these aggregate customer visits, we're aggregating them by the customer ID. I want to see the lifetime orders that have happened for that. Maybe I'm trying to optimize something on my website, like, hey, if this is a customer that spent a lot of money with us based on their traffic and their orders, I want to offer them a certain promotion or something like that in my web application or in my app, right? So for that, I'm going to connect to my order management as well. And I've got this orders core data, this nice operational data that the other department makes available. And you can see here, because I'm going across data planes, that the system automatically determined that that needs to be materialized. So if I go ahead and create that, what's going to happen now is Ascend is going to automatically go out, ingest the copy that's coming from the other data plane. If we look at orders again, right? Orders was in Snowflake. And I'm currently running in a Spark data plane, which is Spark with Iceberg storage. So it's going out, is grabbing a copy of that data from Snowflake, bringing it over into the Spark with Iceberg storage, and making it available to me to do my analytics. Now I want to be able to go and create a transform here that does some logic. And to save some time, of course, I already went and wrote my query. So this is basically what my query is going to look like. I'm going to take these orders, which are basically the core orders that are not aggregated. And I'm going to take these aggregate customer visits. I'm going to put them together, and I'm going to do another layer of aggregation on top. And here I'm going to basically see, this is going to be visits versus orders by customer. So I'll go ahead and I'll create that transform. So now I'm in the Spark data plane. So my processing is going to be happening on the Spark engine. And at the end of this, I can go create a data share, and I can publish this out. I can choose who gets access to this again. Maybe I only want my visitors folks to be able to see it, or maybe I want the customers team to be able to see it because it's valuable to them. So I'll go and create that data share. And then in a second, you should see this all comes up to date. So my transform is done. I have 500 customers. I have the data stitched together across the two different domains, and I've republished that out, and it's now available as another analytical data product. So very quickly before I conclude, I just wanted to be able to show as well that we do have a scheduled data share concept as well. So this is a different environment, slightly different data, but when you basically go here, I'm connecting to some weather API data. And when you do that, when you have the option to schedule your data share, which is a new feature, it's also in private preview, you can actually choose if you want the data share refresh to be continuous. That means when the upstream data flow updates, the downstream will automatically be triggered and run. Or you can choose schedule. In this case, I want to schedule it daily to run at midnight. And now when I do this, my data share is now going to refresh on a different schedule independently from the upstream source, so I can refresh it at a time of my choosing. So this is another feature that you have available to you besides materialized and non-materialized. Generally, you would really use the scheduling only with materialized data shares primarily, which control then when the downstream can basically run. But you can also potentially use it with non-materialized. There's use cases for that as well. Lastly, just to kind of wrap up, if anybody has any questions, definitely we can start getting to some of those. One question that I get asked frequently is, what's the difference between a write connector and a data share? So, if you're familiar with Ascend, write connectors are really when you're trying to share and deliver data to external systems where you have no more control after that point. If you use a data share, Ascend is aware of both sides of that data movement. It's aware of both data planes. And so we have opportunities to optimize things, control the schedule of when things run, and do a lot more automation around that than if you use a write connector. If you use a write connector, the data will go out to the external system, but after that, Ascend doesn't really know what happens to it. So it basically, you can use either of these technologies to implement a data mesh with internal or external stakeholders. But the data shares definitely make it more easy to do, especially because when you connect to a data share, you don't need to know anything about oh, what's the username and password? What server is this data on? How do I get access to this thing? You either have access to it or you don't, and you can just subscribe to it right here, regardless of where the data is coming from. So it's a really powerful feature. So with that, that's what I was planning to demo today. Data shares help you enable a data mesh architecture. If you're using an Ascend for data mesh concept, you can share data across all the main data planes. As I mentioned, it enhances and replaces times 1,000 our existing data feed functionality. It has simplified security and access controls, which I showed you earlier, and you have the ability to do continuous or scheduled consumption from these. So if you're interested in trying this out, definitely hit us up. With that, I want to open it up to any questions that there might be.
Thank you, John. That was awesome. I can't wait to start building my own data mesh. I was sitting there thinking man, how many different data products would there be in some of the data we look at in the marketing department? And I'm sure there's a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, nice one. So there's a couple questions in the Q&A, and I think some of these came in earlier in the session, but I just wanted to make sure that we really double click on some of these things and answer questions fully. And so I believe that we have the answer to this one, but just if you could reiterate, John, can everyone see every data share in Ascend?
Right. So you basically have controls within the product. You can basically choose when you create a data share what the visibility for that data share is. So you can either share it with all data services, which means essentially every data service in the environment, or you can filter it to specific data services. So if your data service is mapped to organizational context, then you can see how if you limit which data service has access to which data share, you're effectively limiting who has access to which data shares in your organizational context too. So absolutely, you have controls for that.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, and I would assume that, along those lines too, people may not have access to every single data service. Is that right? So when you restrict access by data service, you're essentially saying only people that have the only user accounts that are in those data services can actually see it.
Right? Absolutely. And this happens a lot with things like PII, for example. At some point when you're dealing with PII, people have to process data in ways where you can see the PII data, and then you obfuscate it, you obscure it, but then you want other people to be able to use the I can't say the word, the de-anonymized data, basically, where you take away no, not de-anonymized, anonymized. There we go, I got it. You want people to be able to use the anonymized data, the obfuscated data, but you don't want them to see the kind of original PII data. So people will use data services often where they'll process the unobfuscated PII. They'll publish a data share which has it obfuscated, and then allow people to subscribe to the one where it is obfuscated, where you can't see the PII, so other people can work with that data set. That's a canonical use case for sharing across data services.
Perfect. Yeah, well said, John. Thank you. I'll just squeeze one more in here because we're right at time. But so someone is asking, how frequently are these things refreshed? Is it real time?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the two different modes that I mentioned for kind of the subscriptions, so you have continuous and you have scheduled. So Ascend is not a real-time system. We're a batch-oriented, micro-batch-oriented system. However, that being said, we process based on partitions. When you choose continuous, this is connected to an upstream data flow that's got maybe partition data coming in. Continuous means that whenever a change data reaches the publishing side of a data share, so we have two sides, the publishing side and the subscribing side. When data reaches that publisher, it is basically broadcast to all the subscribers at that point. It's not a stream, it's more of publishing like a batch of records, a partition of records downstream, but it is, let's say, event-based in the sense of when it reaches that publisher, it will push it out to all the downstreams. And if you choose scheduled, then you basically get to choose when it consumes from that upstream data feed. So it's basically at that point, you're in charge of how frequently it will pull from the source. Most people don't usually go below like 5-minute refresh, 5-minute refresh intervals for like micro batches or things like that. So you have choices about how it works.
Well said. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, John. Makes a ton of sense. Super. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm super excited to be with you and see the great new features that are coming out on the Ascend platform. And thank you, John, for that amazing presentation and all the work you put into showing us how it works.
Absolutely.
Very inspiring. We're here every week, so please feel free to mark your calendars on Wednesdays or Thursdays if you're in the Asia Pacific region. Thursday mornings for you all. This is Wednesday evening for us. Please feel free to drop in on the next one, and we'll see you then.